I will take the cue from Anne, but it doesn't, it's strange because it doesn't allow me to, okay, to go next, okay, now. From this book, Pedagogies of Crossing, Meditation on Feminism, Sexual Politics, Memory and the Sacred, by Trinidadian Canadian scholar, poet, priestess Jackie Alexander, published in 2005, which will open the path to transnational feminism and its spiritual dimension. I will then discuss a recent rereading of spirituality with Haitian poet and anthropologist Gina Ulysse on Rasanblaj, which is a Haitian Creole term for a spiritual practice on assembling, and on the idea that survival through the spirit is always a survival through nature. So it's an elemental configuration of water, air, earth, and fire. And I will in particular discuss the water implicancy in the sense that we saw yesterday. So even devoid of the idea of relationality. And I will discuss the Atlantic crossing, the remembering, and the Afro-Atlantic spirituality emerged, or deepened would be better to say, in the hold of the slave ship, which was also a tremendous laboratory of love, resistance, and inseparability. And I will do that through The Whale Fall, which is an intense video piece by video performer and artist and vocalist Mayfield Brooks. Is a video piece delving into oceanic, black animal, rebirth, healing, mourning, and breathing. So having briefly outlined my presentation, the structure of my presentation, I would like to start with this book, Pedagogies of Crossing, and how transnational feminism must confront with a more transversal mode of address on the one hand, and a sacred view of experience and practice, one in which, to borrow Latamani famous formulation, the personal is not only political, but spiritual. And it is important to say that when I mention transnational feminism, I mainly refer to two texts by Jackie Alexander and Mohanty. One is Feminist Genealogies, Colonial Legacies, Democratic Futures, published in 1997, 3 years after the publication of Scattered Hegemonies, which is considered the first book to use the term transnational feminism by Greenwell and Kaplan. And then the second essay is a cartography of knowledge, including this collection, Critical Transnational Feminist Praxis, published in 2010. And in this essay, Alexander and Mohanty give a more articulated definition of transnational feminism, always perceived as a way of thinking about women in similar contexts across the world, in different geographical spaces, rather than as all women across the world, but now with a more engaged concern for intersectionality, collective responsibility, mutual accountability, the politics of location, and ecological awareness. But for Alexander, there are at least two more layers this definition should wrestle with. And one is the mode of address. Who is the we when it comes to, for example, women of color, and the role of Afro-Atlantic spiritualities. And when I say Afro-Atlantic spirituality, I mainly refer to one of the two practiced by Jackie Alexander. She's priestess in Vodou from Haiti, and Lukumi Santeria from Cuba. In one of Pedagogy's revelatory chapters, Remember This Bridge, Remembering Ourselves, that pays homage to Gloria Anzaldua's This Bridge Called My Back, Alexander asks the following set of questions. Who are we now, women of color, 20 years later? Have we lived differently, loved differently? Did this bridge get us there? Did it coax us into the habit of listening to each other and learning each other's way of seeing and being? Who are we now, 20 years later? Why do we need to remember? And my reply would have the sound of another set of questions. Who are we now in 2021, so 16 years later since Pedagogy's publication? Why do we need to remember? And I think that those two layers, the mode of address and the role of spirituality in the feminist struggle, are already at work in this set of questions. If we look at the former, the we as a mode of address, transnational feminism clearly figures as a paradigm aimed at unsettling Western epistemologies of a spatially and temporally determined self by looking at the pronoun we as a more intimate, personal, political mode of address, but also more intersectional. And even if Alexander's questions are explicitly addressed to women of color, they don't obliterate the many differences within the name women of color. She rather complicates the homogeneity usually assumed when talking of women of color, which, like third women, is a terminology widely used by her and Mohanty, even in the 2010 essay. She therefore comes to terms with what Cuban artist Mirta Quintanales calls the paradox of naming, in that if we recognize that women of color, third world women, do not necessarily include all oppressed women, and that oppression of color doesn't merely correspond to class oppression, or that African American women and Caribbean women do not share the same memory of colonialism and slavery, then the we won't suffer unbalanced relations. But more importantly, it's only if we take the risk to see ourselves as a part of one another, even in the context of difference, and underpin the belief that it could never happen to us, only then we can recognize our communal crossing and gather all the relics left by colonial dismemberment. As a result, the we comes to embody a different kind of identification, not on one which responds to who we are, but identified with whom we are. It's a move towards a disentanglement from the human perceived as a single being, separated from other species. African-American poet and cultural theorist Fred Modern, by recalling Martinican poet Edouard Glissant and his famous utterance, consent à n'être plus un seul, precisely embraces that consent not to be a single being as a mode of address of blackness that doesn't merely dovetail with Black people. As he claims in Under Commons, Fugitive Planning and Black Study, a tremendous needed book co-authored with Stefano Arni, Blackness is rather a social force, accessible to all, a spiritual dance, a dance with the animal, the animus, the soul, able, if consented, to, and I quote Modern, tear this ship down completely and build something new. And it is with this idea of blackness as we, which is also they or them, because there is also this shift now towards the use of them, the vernacular hem, that I want to share with you my journey through Afro-Atlantic spiritualities pedagogies. Because if we, they, them, are not willing to accept that anti-Black racism, that is of course intertwined with patriarchal heteronormativity and extractive capitalism, will kill us all, then no coalition for modern, no spiritual change for me through Alexander could ever matter. And again, I think that here Morton's words are very needed. The coalition emerges out of your recognition that it's fucked up for you, in the same way that we already recognize that it's fucked up for us. I don't need your help. I just need you to recognize that this shit is killing you too, however much more subtly, you stupid motherfucker, you know? On the other hand, this call for no separation, wonderfully discussed as inseparability by Denise Ferreira da Silva, as we saw yesterday, and I will show later, is not an attempt to get rid of difference. On the contrary, it is invested in the effort to reply to the following question, once again posited by Alexander. How do we continue to be rooted in the particularities of our cultural homes without allegiance to the boundary of nation state, yet remain simultaneously committed to a collectivized politics of identification and solidarity? And here I think that the second issue emerging from Alexander's previous set of questions responds to this simultaneous double movement of belonging and displacement. It is spirituality folded in the crossing, which is a pedagogic's central metaphor drawn from the enforced Atlantic crossing of the millions of Africans that serviced for the consolidation of British, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Dutch Empire. And not only consolidation of wealth, but also consolidation of that very Western epistemology transnational feminism tries to depart from and end. Still, as modern remarks through Frank Wilderson, the third poetic image of the fantasy in the whole, there was tremendous life in the crossing, and not only death. There was excess of imagination and proximity of touching flesh in the hold of the slave ship. Many enslaved people from Africa practiced different kind of spiritualities. They had their spiritualities inscribed in the flesh, because as Alexander Hagius, flesh is the embodiment of the spirit, not to be meant as an immaterial ghost entity, but a tangible one through nature and its elemental configuration, and a genealogical one through the ancestors. And I think that these two are the most interesting tropes of resistance found in Afro-Atlantic spirituality that could inform a change. Alexander tries to specify that spirituality is not the name for an alternative metaphysics. And although most of the Afro-Atlantic spiritualities are sacred knowledge with its secrecy, language, initiation, and have been in many cases manipulated, even by the same people who claim to be the most entitled to practice it. Something, for example, that Fanon was critical of in The Wretched of the Earth, or something exemplified by Haiti, the first ever Black republic to ever exist in the world, where Vodou, the religion, spirituality, no religion, Vodou, served both as a revolutionary spiritual force and a terrorizing military apparatus during the Duvalier dictatorship. Well, despite this, and or maybe because of this, because I mean, in the sense that we must engage with spirituality, otherwise, if it is taken as a work of the imagination more than of the mind, it is given to teach the practice and art of non-separation. And for Jackie Alexander, there is an obliteration, of course, in academia because of secularism, primarily because experience has been understood in purely secular terms, and because the secular has been divested of the sacred and the spiritual divested of the political. This way of knowing is not generally believed to have the capacity to instruct feminism in the United States in any meaningful way. But flesh is central to the Middle Passage and to the spiritual, also because it became the site of a grammar disarticulated from theories of being, mind superiority, and patriarchy. It became the thing, valuable and at the same time devalued, ungendered nothingness. As Hortense Spillers has superbly written in a revolutionary essay, Mama's Baby, Papa's Baby, an American grammar book, I would make a distinction, and I quote, between body and flesh, and impose that distinction as the central one between captive and liberated subject positions. In that sense, before the body, there is the flesh. That 0 degree of social conceptualization that doesn't escape concealment under the brush of discourse. If we think of the flesh as a primary narrative, then we mean it's seared, divided, ripped apartness, riveted to the ship's hull, fallen, or escaped overboard. Spillers brought those words the same year, 1987, of another revolutionary and terribly beautiful piece of literature, Beloved, by Toni Morrison, which is also a celebration of the spirit made manifest through the flesh. The spirit of beloved, remembered in that very flesh, to be loved, to be touched, as our grandmother, Baby Sachs, exhorts to do in the clearance, which is the natural space of love. And here I quote from Beloved, yonder they don't love your flesh. They despise it, They don't love your eyes. They just as soon pick them out. No more do they love your skin, the skin of your back, on your back. Yonder the flayed, and home my people, they don't love your hands. Those they only use, tie, bind, chop off, and leave empty. Love your hands, love them, raise them up and kiss them. No, they don't love your mouth. You gotta love it. The dark, dark liver, love it, love it. And the beating heart, love that too. And this is why Alexander cites the same paragraph when she declares that the tremendous life of that flesh must be remembered, in the sense that Toni Morrison meant it when she wrote about rememory and beloved. Because remembering, putting the members of the flesh together, can be an antidote to alienation, separation, and amnesia produced by colonial dismemberment. The figuring out of remembering as a transnational feminist methodology, and here I use the verb figuring out in the sense that modern uses. Sorry. Sorry, it was not. Sorry, my dog. She came before because I told that at 5 I would be done. And yeah, so in the sense that Toni Morrison meant it when she wrote about it in Beloved, no? In this wonderful piece of literature. Because remembering, putting the members of the flesh together can be, as I said, this antidote of to alienation, separation. But this remember, the figuring out of remember, I was saying in the verb figuring out, I use the verb here, figuring out in the sense modern uses it. Let's think, let's really imagine figuring out a change. Appeared in Alexandrian Imagination already in 1998 at the Uprootings and Regroundings, Questions of Home and Migration Conference at the University of Lancaster, UK. And during that event, she made the following statement: colonialism was about dismemberment. This statement is a very interesting story, as it led to the figuring out of another feminist practice of non-separation. In the form of insistent iteration, it became important to another Caribbean woman, the Haitian anthropologist Gina Ulysse, who started on the top, who started a rich conversation over the terms remembering and dismemberment that culminated in a collaborative, issue of Hemispherica, on the importance of gathering through bodies, flesh, spiritual guides, in memory what colonialism has separated. And this gathering takes the sound of Rasanblaj. This is a Haitian Creole term that refers to assembly, compilation, and listing, regrouping of ideas, things, people, spirits. For example, fais your assemblage, do a gathering, a ceremony, a protest. Rasanblaj as an anti-colonial practice, method, and narrative, like rememory, is deeply rooted in the colonial enterprise and Middle Passage. The Article 16 of the French Code Noir forbade the gathering of enslaved people of different masters for any purpose at any time. It forbade rassemblage. Separation was indeed legalized, and it would be ontologized later by philosophy of the Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment with theories of the transparent eye and rationality, as Denise Ferreira da Silva has wonderfully discussed in towards the whole idea of race. And Silvana illustrated that yesterday. Still, rassemblage, this collaborative urge to get reunited, regrouped, and not separated in order to feel the same thing, the same will for change, is everywhere and always. Because as Alexander declares, it is informed by the spirit of reassembling and its ubiquity. When people from different areas, different reaches, different geographies Different disciplines, different practices are calling for the same thing. Some spirit of reassembly is already at work. If remembering the work of the spirit through the flesh, for Alexander, Rasanblaj comes to reinforce the balance between transnationalism and specificity, and between the ever-changing yet permanent condition of the cosmos. This work of balance cannot be done alone. Community is needed. The previous we must be inspired by and with more will to change. And again, it's not a will to imagine another world, but to imagine the world as we don't know it, if I can borrow in a reversed way, Denisa Ferreira, poetical language, or as we knew it, but it was not credited enough or prevented to be credited enough. Or as modern has always reminded us, is not a will to end a certain worldview, but to end the very idea of worldview. He sees the specific and material history of the drowned and burned, the sheep and eld, as the condition for the release, not just of the prevailing worldview, but of the very idea of worldview, of transcendental standpoint and pure land. We need to learn from those communities who don't ever think in binary terms. Indigenous communities, spiritual ones, but also ecological ones, animals and plants, can teach us how to remember and communicate beyond the political, if the political is meant as a separation of the public and private. No? Its etymology teaches us that it was the city versus what was outside the quota. Beyond the gender divisions and beyond the communal we. And this is why many artists, as I say, they prefer them, him, or shorten the vernacular him. We, they, them, must learn from the elements. We need to learn from them all, not separated. There is air in the ocean's breath, and the land, and also burning fire in its surface and nucleus. Even if water is the element most implicated with change, as Alexander claims in their conversation on Rasanblaj. And here, the last quote on Rasanblaj before we move to the whaleful. So, blowing apart the pronoun that we, in relationship to ourselves, when we receive that message of Rasanblaj, Spirit is saying, we are everywhere already. Why? Because that's the nature of the universe. But we didn't stop being everywhere because you decided to separate us. We didn't stop because we are not partial in that kind of way. We're not sometime-ish like you home. There's this expression used here in Tobago, you too sometime-ish. You behave this way one day and tomorrow another. You sometime-ish. We are not as sometime-ish as you, spirits are saying. Spirit is also saying, since you all created the separation, you are the ones responsible for the regroupement. What then if we imagine this remembering the body and as with its remembering flesh as the site of this rassemblage, regroupement? What if the breathing of the undrawn flesh of the Middle Passage is not separate from the breathing of the ocean and its animal and vegetal creatures? What if the cellular food of those who drowned is making possible life on Earth? Ultimately, what if our breathing on the land is not separate from the breathing of whales? This last is not a provocative question. This is the context of Rasanblaj, the context of the Middle Passage, and the undrowned. As Alexis Pauline Gams has brilliantly argued in a recent Undrowned Black feminist lesson from Marine MAMMALS. And this is a book which is also an invitation to practice another way. And when I say another way, of course, again, it doesn't mean that it didn't exist before. Maybe it has been practiced, it has not been practiced enough, or it has been prevented from being practiced. So it's another way to piece together our lives, to practice our inseparability and the implication of life and death, to practice another way of breathing, one which requires us and allows us to tell another narrative of the Middle Passage. And here a quote from Gam's book. Those who survived in the underbellies of boats under each other under unbreathable circumstances are the undrowned, and their breathing is not separate from the drawing of their kin and fellow captives. Their breathing is not separate from the breathing of the ocean. Their breathing is not separate from the sharp exhale of hunted whales, their kindred also. Gam's work was published last year in November, and it's also a profound reflection on the pandemic that, coupled with the unbreathable racial condition, caused many deaths, especially in the Black population. It is also a manual for a better breathing. It is surprisingly interesting that almost in the same season, another Black woman, the African-American artist, choreographer, dancer Mayfield Brooks, was working on a video titled "The Whale Fall." Also originated from a profound meditation on the grief of Black women in the unbreathable planet we inhabit. Mayfield herself got infected with COVID, and although she had mild effects, she couldn't breathe. She started to think of being in the belly of a whale. And the story of Jonah and the whale from the King James Bible came to her mind. As Jonah, who was punished by God for having refused to bring his words to Nineveh and sent to the dark belly of a whale for 3 days and 3 nights, Mayfield felt compassed about in a dark space. But it was a space of meditation and blessing too, because as also French-Algerian writer Enes Sixou reminds us, this obedience to God, a refuge in the belly of the whale, is a refusal to understand any determined standpoint, the very idea of worldview. And here a quote from the book of Prometheus, because Jonah's real story is the one never told. Never was he as stupendously happy as during those 3 days and 3 nights of eternity. He was granted an experience that women dream of. He lived when he was mature in the adored whale's belly, in real paradise. How does one get there? By disobedience, by passion, running away. Mayfield also started reading manuals and books on whales and the incredible phenomenon on the whale fall. When whales die, they fall and sink until they reach the ocean floor. There, decomposition starts, and normal scavengers recycle the body back into the earth and air in a matter of days and weeks. Like Gams recounts in her manual, and Mayfield does in The Whale Fall, she identified her ancestral grief with the whale fall. The whale became their kin. They started then to imagine a journey into and through the whale fall. One very similar to Anyanwu, one of the main characters of Octavia Butler's Wild Seed, which has been also a very influential book for this video performance. Whales, after all, are transspecial mammals. They are queer, matriarchal, fierce, conflictual, providing food for land, water, breeding, and giving breath, even when they are carcasses, as we can see. If we look at this aspect of the performance, the whale fall is very close to Mayfield's previous work, Letters to Marcia, based on dense and written notes to Marsha P. Johnson, the transgender activist whose body was found in the Hudson River in 1992. And I quote from an interview that she had recently for the New York Times. I think a lot about her body in the Hudson River and the cellular kind of existence of bodies in water, Brooks said. How even if the body disintegrates, the cells can still survive. And then in the idea that a molecular structure may have commuted with some of the waves that showed up in the bay last year. And so Mayfield flesh became the whale flesh, but also the captured flesh of the ancestors and those who have fallen forever to the ocean floor. So the whale fall becomes a site of Rasanblaj, a gathering of whispers, birds, what biologists call echolocations, that is the bouncing sounds of waves while communicating each other, and we will listen to them later, and also the sound of the ocean. And it's also a gathering of cries and of the fluid movements of flesh improvising while black. The statement of the artist that whatever movement she, they do is a decomposing dance and choreographing breath. Like an ecology improvising while black continues to evolve as a process that moves in relation to other organisms, environments, and events in order to conjure ancestral healing with human and non-human ancestors. And by gesturing at the parallel between black bodies and the way Mayfield declares, there's this whole other aspect to it that brought me to how so many black bodies were dying from COVID and the amount of toxins that black bodies carry, whether it's from trauma or living near brownfields or the cost of poverty. I started feeling that the whale body is very similar to the black body. But before we follow this journey of transportation of both decomposition and remembering, a prayer poem is needed. And here when I say prayer, again, I say in the sense of breathing. A prayer is meant as a breathing practice, not in a religious sense. And I would like to recite you some lines of a praise poem composed by Alexander at Punta Cana, Caracol, in Mexico, and penned in conclusion to Pedagogies of Crossing, a poem to Yemaya. Yemaya, she's the goddess of the ocean. And I recite, without you, I would not know life. I would not be myself, yourself, in me, in you. Sin tú no hay vida. Mother, teacher, I learn how to caress from the cadence of waves, subtle, gentle, tumultuous, enveloping. In the vastness of ocean surrounded by your treasure, wash me, mother of life, of water. Take me to the underground home on top of the sand, peligrosísima. Take me, desnuda, without pretense, sin nada, rebirthed in the cadence of waves. And let's play the start of the movie. Okay, we can stop here because we have other two scenes, white and blue. These are the color of Yemaya. Mayfield is her daughter. In her matriarchal constellation, Yemaya takes care of her will not to be separated from the sea. The water, which will be never distant from the land, for Mayfield is an extension of the land. And the last week in a conversation we had, what she's needing is this connection to the land. Last week in a conversation we had, she told me that I can walk to the ocean because it's not separate from the land, it's under land. And while we had this conversation, of course, to my mind came the reading of A Difference Without Separability, because at the same time I was doing the reading of Difference Separability, and the planner we saw yesterday as an infinite composition in which each existence singularity is contingent upon its becoming one possible expression of all the other existence, with which it is entangled beyond space and time. And as Gams comments, whales process air in a very similar way to us. They were land animals, they are related to elephants, and they made the metamorphosis again to the water. Like Anatsin's mushrooms, which have an interlocking underground communication, MAMMALS too create with their sounds a network of resilience, acceptance, responsiveness, and accountability. And so there is tremendous life in the ocean, as it was also in the old of the slave ship. And the whole takes the shape of an old piano in the video performance. I imagine that as the whole of the slave ship, and she imagined that as well. She said that that piano had its own life, and it was exactly as a ship. And let's see, this is a work installation here in Portugal. You can see this is the hold of the slave ship, titled El Barco. This Portuguese Afro-descendant artist. And let's see the piano with its own life. Okay, and also it is this piano. It also is there as a tangible homage to Billie Holiday's Strange Fruit, and is a prelude to the fall. The strange fruit ghost, partly falling, partly swinging, dancing flesh, sinking until they reach the ocean floor, a sea of bones. And here another excerpts, I have two and then we finish, where the dancer's backbone, desnuda, naked, with moving vertebrae, remembering this bridge called my back, makes the transition to life again. This is, okay. Oh, sorry. Okay, and once on this, that we were listening to the other echolocations, the bouncing sounds on of waves, and once on the floor and the morning journey is over, there is only breathing and a Rasanblaj waiting. There is a convivial moment, final moment, of friends who couldn't visit Mayfield due to the pandemic. And so they get reunited in this final and last clip, and then I finish and sharing. Okay, and so my last question is, who are then we 16 years later after pedagogies of crossing, have we loved, remember differently? Have they listen across species? And will spiritual imagination contribute to end the world as we know it? Thank you. Hvala vam. Okay, thank you so much.